first, kind of tell you how I'm here today. First of all, you need to understand I am not an economist. I am going to show you scads of economic data, and if you have any questions, we're fortunate to have several technical experts in the audience and they can answer them. And so that's the deal. I got interested in this subject about, well, it's kind of broadly the federal budget deficit and how that relates to debt. Back during the COVID deals, we were spending money like crazy. And I seen several articles in the newspaper and read about it and got interested. So I started, just as a learning exercise, I started gathering data and putting together something for me to understand what the federal budget's all about and how it works. And I don't know, a few months ago, I was talking to Stuart and told him I had done that, and he said, gee, that's interesting. And I see a copy. I said, sure. So I sent him a copy of my slides, and he said, that's interesting, and he thought that perhaps this group would like to see the story. And so that's the reason I'm here, is because Stuart asked me to give you this story that I put together over the last couple of years about the federal budget. If you don't mind, I'm going to sit down, and hopefully all this stuff will work. But you start off with spending, and this is the federal spending, and it says that in the recent years, our federal government is spending just short of $20,000 on each and every one of us. That's how much they spend per capita, just under $20,000. That's a constant dollars chart, and so you can see it's been going up quite steadily, 350% in 6 decades, and that's the federal spending. And then, when you recognize that the state and local governments also spend money, that adds about a third to the total. And so that's our spending. And what are we spending on? This is the federal budget again. Half of it goes to Medicare, healthcare stuff, and Social Security. And the other half, you can see on the right-hand side, national defense is in there. We have to pay interest on our debt. And then there's some other stuff called income security. That's employee benefits, and tax credits, and food stamps, and whole collection of other things that they consider income security. So that's where what we spend our money on. This chart is a historical chart going all the way back to the 60s, and it shows how the 3 categories of spending have gone. Interest is on top, and it's been reasonably constant, wiggles a little bit. And this is the discretionary spending. That's the stuff that this Congress can decide on. And then mandatory spending is on the bottom, are those things particularly like Medicare and Social Security and other things that we've committed to us to spend, and that's on autopilot each year. It just goes on and on. They figure out how much it's going to increase. So you can see that the mandatory spending has gone from 26% of our budget up to over 60% now. So that represents a big chunk of what we spend. You can also compare the spending to our gross domestic product. That's another measurement form that people use. And you can see the history. This is divided up into interest, which is again, reasonably constant at around maybe 2 or 3 or 4% of GDP at the bottom. And then we've been steadily decreasing our defense spending relative to the GDP from around 10% in the 60s down to maybe 3 or 4 today. What's really been rising is the non-defense spending. That's everything else besides defense. And again, that's predominantly health care and Social Security. Low interest rates help for a while. For the last, say, 15 or so years, we've had really unusually low interest rates. Short-term treasury bills have been near zero for most of that time, and even the longer ones, the 10-year T-bills, have been under 4%, 3 or 4%, all all the way through a year or so ago, and all of a sudden, both of those interest rates has gone back up to what most people would consider a more traditional level. But that's a problem when you have to pay interest on your debt. We'll see more about that in a minute. Okay, here's where the federal government gets its money from. We're individual income taxes, and we're the biggest block of revenue. We pay, if you're working, you pay Social Security, and that's the second biggest. And also, if you're working, they take out the Medicare from your paycheck, that's that block. And then corporations pay income taxes, and that's that block right there, and then there's a bunch of smaller ones. So that's where the federal government gets its money from. Here's a historical view of the same thing. Individual income taxes as a percent of the total revenue have been relatively constant across that whole time frame. And the payroll taxes, though, which is what, when you're working, they take out Medicare and Social Security and some other stuff, that has gone up substantially. And the corporate taxes on corporations have gone down fairly substantially over that period of time. So that's just the history of where the income comes from.
Great presentation, Jim.
Thank you. I'm gonna go so fast you can't see the trucks. There it is. Let's see if this will work. Yes. This is last year. We spent, we took in a revenue about $4.5 trillion, and we spent just over $6 trillion. So we had a deficit last year of $1.7 trillion. And the categories are there. Excuse me, I've already mentioned most of those. So the deficit is very straightforward. It's spending minus revenue. Excuse me, I've got some non-contagious bronchitis, so don't worry about that cough. That's an allergy. This is the deficit history going all the way back to 1970, and it's easy to see the red ink that's been coming in the last few years. There's the COVID year. We're really spending a bunch of money for COVID. We've cut back some since then. We're here at about 1.7. That's where we were in 2023. We're roughly halfway through the fiscal year this year for 2024, and we're running a little ahead of last year's deficit. One of the reasons for that is interest rates have gone up, and we're having to pay a fair amount more interest on our debt than we used to, like a third more than we did last year. Okay, if you deficit spend for very long, the only thing that can happen is you have to borrow money to pay for that, and so your debt goes up. And this is probably the most dramatic chart I have. We were doing reasonably well back in the 90s, and it took off, and all of a sudden, wow, we're up here north of $25 trillion in debt, and adding to that every day. Okay, federal debt as a percentage of GDP. This is one of the other ways that people measure a country's economic viability. So this is the debt as a percentage of the gross domestic product. And when we have wars, we spend a lot of money, we have to borrow a lot of money. So there's World War II. We got up to 120%, and then we spent that debt back down again, and then we have had another war lately, but we've enjoyed a lot more spending, and so our spending has gone up to today. We're at a higher level than we were back at the end of World War II in terms of our debt, federal debt as a percentage of GDP. So who owns the debt? Who are we indebted to? I used to think it was all China. I don't know why. I thought that's not accurate. China is certainly in there. This is about a third of it was other countries, and you can see them there. The bulk, about a half, is us. Householders, other investors that buy government bonds, for example. So we're the holders of government debt, mutual funds, which people own. State governments and local governments buy federal debt. And so that's everybody. Now, this one, we discovered that we could borrow from ourselves back a few years ago. We put a fancy name on it. We called it quantitative easing. And it was a way that we stimulated the economy by basically borrowing from ourselves. And so we hold our own debt. About a quarter of our debt is that number right there. Here's how we compare to other countries. Again, this is debt as a percentage of GDP. We're second only to Venezuela in the Americas in terms of our debt. Our other Canada's there, Mexico 56%. We're getting close to Italy, and maybe, hopefully, not even Greece, but we're ahead of everybody but Italy and Greece and Europe in terms of our debt. Japan has got a really unusual situation with the way their whole economy works, so that's an outlier that I won't even try to describe. But they're very high, and there you can see China and Korea. There's Russia at 20%. They, of course, get a lot of their money from selling oil, and if they try to sell debt, I wonder how many people are going to be willing to buy their debt for fear that they might not pay it back. But at any rate, Russia's pretty low and we're pretty high. Here's a comparison of taxes in this country versus Western Europe. It's how much a worker who earns $40,000 a year will pay. And it should be no surprise to you that taxes are a lot higher in Europe than they are here. You can see that 17,500 is what that European would pay. And in the United States, our average $40,000 a year earner will pay just under $12,000 in taxes. We get to keep 71% of our paycheck in this country, and Europe only gets to keep 56%. So they're a lot higher tax than we are. Here's another way to look at the same data. Western Europe versus the United States. Income taxes are a good bit lower. The payroll taxes that we and your employers pay is substantially lower. Europe has a very large national sales tax. They call it the value-added tax. We have a sales tax that's local, but that's a comparison of what amounts to sales taxes. So we are much less taxed than Western Europe. There are only really two ways to reduce the deficit. You can either spend less on current programs and on generating new initiatives, or you can tax more. There aren't many other ways to reduce the deficit. Those are the two ways. So if you look at the first one of those, if you're going to reduce spending, you have a few choices. The biggest one is the entitlements program, Medicare and Social Security. It's really hard to imagine any politician who wants to get reelected who's going to talk about reducing Medicare and Social Security benefits. So that's probably, in my opinion, probably not likely. You can reduce your defense spending always. We've been doing that. You can do that some more. We've got some unusual defense spending this year with the support we're giving to Ukraine and Israel. So that's a choice. Or you can stop doing new initiatives. We had a huge amount of COVID response. We're spending literally trillions of federal dollars to try to fight climate change. And you can see some of the categories there. We're spending government money to build chip plants in the United States so we can bring that back from Taiwan and China. We're relieving the student debt, and that ends up being an expense if they don't get debt back. I just looked, and as of right now, we've already eliminated $167 million in student debt. And, it's an election year, so every politician in election year offers feel-good things. There was a high-speed rail announced just the other day, so there's all kinds of new initiatives. Every time you do those, it adds to your debt. So the other side of the equation is you can get more revenue. You can increase personal income taxes. You can increase corporate income taxes. You can increase payroll taxes, which is primarily Social Security and Medicare. And then there are a couple of other possibilities that we don't have now that you could decide to enact and bring in some more money. We could put a national sales tax like Europe does. That can bring in a lot of money. It adds more to what we pay. And one of the things that a lot of people are talking about is establish a carbon tax, which also helps reduce emissions from a global warming standpoint. So those are just question mark categories of things that we could consider to get more money. Here's the history of taxes in terms of total individual tax receipts for everybody put together as a percentage of the gross domestic product. That's been, maybe up slightly, but relatively constant since 1960. But what has changed substantially is the incremental top individual tax rate for personal income. In the 60s, we were 90% on that top rate, and today we're 37. So you can see how we've cut that top tax rate for individuals. Here is the average tax. This is not that top rate now. This is on average what different income earners pay. The top 1% of the income people in the United States pay about 26% of their income on taxes. And that progressively goes down so that when you get to the lower half of wage earners, they only pay 3% of what they make in taxes. So that's, I think most people would say that's a fairly progressive tax deal, which is what we say we want to do. Here's another way to look at the same thing. Over 40% of all income taxes are paid by the top 10% of the earners. And the people who are in the bottom half of the earning level pay just over 2% of the total income taxes. That's where we are right now. You can look at the growth in some of these payroll taxes. This is 1940 until now. There's Social Security. It's grown, all these grew fairly substantially until around the 1990, and they've been fairly constant since then. So, what is that? 10 or 11% of your paycheck goes for Social Security, disability. Hospital insurance, that's Part A on Medicare. That takes up another chunk, and you get up to a total of 15% of a worker's payroll that goes to taxes today. Here's another thing that I don't think should be any surprise. It is a chart. It just says that when you retire, you're going to get more than you paid in for your benefits. Let's look at this, which is a married, two people working in the household, average earnings. For their Social Security, they paid in that amount, and they get out a little bit more. So they'll make more than they put in for Social Security, but they get a whole lot more out for Medicare. They paid in that much Medicare, and over the rest of their lifetime, after they retire, they'll draw out, 3 times as much. And then those are just some other income levels and for people who are retiring far down the road. So here we get into the government's projections on where we're going. This is the Congressional Budget Office's data, current data, and they say that from their perspective, we're going to keep spending more than we're taking in, as far out as you can see. And they also say that they believe that the interest rates are not going to go back to those really low numbers that we enjoyed for so long. They are projecting that the interest rates are gonna stay around 3 to 4%. And if that's the case, we're gonna be paying a fair amount of interest on our debt as we go forward. And here's what that is. This is the net interest as a percent of revenue. We're here in the 10 to 15% range, and we're projecting that by 2053, we'll be up to 30% of our revenue will have to pay out in interest if their projections come to pass.
Let's make one clarification. They are required to assume no change in law. So their projections are basically what is current law.
Yeah, that's correct. It's based on what's current law. That's correct. Laws can change, and we'll talk about that in a minute. It's interesting to note that in this year, or last year, this interest rate exceeded our national defense. Here is another projection on debt. This goes all the way back to the country, and it's debt as a percent of GDP. You can see the wars. There's the Civil War. We paid it down. World War I, we spent more money than we took in, paid it down. World War II, we paid it down. We're here, we've gone back up to now above World War II. We haven't had another war yet, but we're here. And these projections that we just showed you say we're gonna go all the way up to 166% in 2024. This year, we had a lot of short-term loans, so this year, we're gonna be refinancing nearly a third of the debt that we have. And that's probably gonna be at higher interest rates than we have right now. Unfunded mandates. That's Social Security and Medicare particularly. So the question is, what about those two? We talk about them a lot. Are they gonna run out of money? If so, when, and what happens when they do? So these are a couple of charts that look at healthcare spending. This is again primarily Medicare. This is 2022, how many $1 trillion we spend on Medicare, Medicaid, Obamacare, and this is the employer thing. So you can see that we're gonna go up, in 10 years, we're gonna go up substantially from about 1.7 trillion up to 3.3 for healthcare, let's call it. That spending rate is faster than the growth of the GDP over that period of time. And among other reasons, there are two big ones. That's the fact that we've got a lot more older people now as a percentage of population than we had. So we're drawing Social Security and Medicare, and then we have inflation as the costs are going up. So that's a couple of reasons why you have that. Guess who spends the most money on healthcare? It's us, right here in this room. I know that's no surprise, but there's some numbers. 85 plus spends $33,000 a year on healthcare, and those youngsters only spend 3 or 4. And so there's a big difference in age related to how much money you need to spend on healthcare. This is a projection of Medicare. We have a savings account for Part A, which is the hospital piece of Medicare. We call it trust fund. We've built up some money. It peaked around 2005, and we've been spending down our savings account since then. And we are projected that savings account is going to run out about 2031. So we won't have any more money in our savings account. So you say, well, what happens? Well, this is just the story of where that money comes from. And the point is that as we run out of money, increasingly the federal government, general revenue, is going to have to pay for the Medicare that's not coming in from either using up the trust fund or from people. All right, let's switch over to Social Security now. We don't have a trust fund in Social Security. It's kind of pay as you go. But we have promised each American, we promised that you'll get, you know, when you retire, we're gonna pay you the Social Security for the rest of your life. And that has created an unfunded obligation. We don't have the money for it, but we promised to pay it over time. So this is a 75-year unfunded obligation. Right now, we have just under $25 trillion in unfunded obligation for Social Security. And if we wanted to just stay even with respect to how much money we're taking in for Social Security, we would need to raise the Social Security tax about 3 to 4% from what it is now, just to hold steady going forward. This is, excuse me, this is the income and the expense, and when your expense is higher than your income, you create deficit. So that's the deficit going forward in the Social Security Fund, and it projects that we're gonna run out again in the early 2030s. Before I do it, this is the age thing. No surprise that we have a lot more older people and a lot more younger people, a lot less younger people. We always had 1960, we had 5.1 people that were employed compared to every person who was retired. Today it's 2.7, and it's going to 2.3. So a lot fewer workers have to pay for a lot more retired people.
We should all have some more kids.
We should all have some more kids. A lot of those kids don't particularly care to pay for this thing. The Social Security Trust Fund is gonna run out in 2033. And when that happens, one of two things could happen. We could either fall back to just paying out how much money is coming in, and that would represent about roughly a 20% reduction in your Social Security check. And that will just keep us even with how much we're taking in from those fewer people who are working. Or the federal government could say, okay, we'll start borrowing more and paying more into the general revenue, and we'll keep you up here. So who knows what's gonna happen. Sometime in the next less than 10 years, we'll probably find out. The Congress has recognized that this is an issue. And so late last year, the House and the Senate both passed an act to study forming a bipartisan, both houses, fiscal commission, who, if it ever gets done, their job would be to find legislation that we could pass and stabilize and decrease the national debt. So they are hopefully gonna try to put together a group of broad people to address that tough issue. It's out of House committee, there's a House review that's due about now. Who knows where that's gonna go, but that's what we said the plan is, as of right now. So here's my opinion, this is getting near the end of it, I think we've got a serious issue. I show an ostrich with his head in the sand, and I show old Pogo over here who said, we've met the enemy, and he is us. And it's not politicians, it's us. We want more spending than we can afford. That's my opinion. Now, there are people who disagree with that. They'd be like Alfred E. Newman, he says, what, me worry? This country is the world's biggest economy. Our dollar is the strongest, it's the world's reserve currency. And because of that really strong economic position, we shouldn't worry about borrowing more and increasing the debt. We can do that for a long time going forward. And the only issues that we have to work out are those annual budgets, which how much we spend, how much we have to pay in interest, and how that creates a problem with the regular budget. So that's all I have to say in terms of presenting. I hope that will have maybe stimulated a few comments and lead to some discussion. Again, I'm looking for our economic experts in the audience to answer all those questions. Did.
I'd like to see a show of hands of how many people knew that all of us receive more Medicare and Social Security dollars than we pay in. Everybody knew that? Huh? Well, yeah, I'm shocked because I've given talks at UT and to over age 65, beautiful, whatever, and they were not aware of that at all. So that's good. Now, how many of you are going to have extra children now so we can have?
Bob, you have a question?
Yes, first of all, I agree completely with your conclusions, Jim. This morning I looked up in the CBO projections, what portions of the spending were going up and down over the next 10 years. Medicare is going up rapidly as a percentage of GDP. Social Security is going up, but not quite as rapidly. And all other expenditures as a percentage of GDP are going down over the next 10 years. So the clue is you gotta fix the Medicare expense. We spend 18% of GDP on medical expense as a country. The next highest is Germany at 12, Canada's at 10. Until we fix the medical expense problem, we're never gonna solve this particular mess.
Other comments?
One of the problems with Medicare Advantage is that Medicare Advantage is overbilling. The trust is spending a huge amount of money that is just dishonest.
More than half of Americans now have a Medicare Advantage policy versus traditional Medicare, so more than half.
And do people know about that overbilling that Medicare Advantage is doing?
I'll give you an opinion. I think maybe not, I don't think they care. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, the problem is that under Medicare Advantage, the physicians that are participating get to anticipate what their patients are likely to do next year. And if they think they're gonna be worse, they get a bigger allotment per person. So a doctor can say, well, this fellow had a bad cold last year. I think he's a serious health risk for next year for pneumonia or something. Or he slipped and fell, so he'll probably break a hip next year. By inflating those, the Medicare participants get a bigger share, so it's a license to steal. You can just make a very pessimistic outlook for your patients, and that enables you to get a much higher payment than a Medicare Advantage. And there's a solution to that, but it's not going to help you with the people, which is cap it off at that standard Medicare rate.
Okay.
It's a couple things. One, I think the percent of, of debt to GNP comparing other countries is it's bad almost everywhere. For instance, China, you've got it 77%. If you include the debt of all the counties that have funded all the things, they still have to, it's way over all us. And so I think we're in a situation where we've got worldwide debt that's unsustainable. And then the second thing is on the commission. Is that commission for Medicare, for Social Security, or for both? Those commissions that are being.
It's for any spending, which includes both, but it's a broad-based question.
So it doesn't include taxes?
Yeah,
Or does it?
sure, it's whatever relates to that, which is all the above.
So let me the devil's advocate with that. So when we had 90 and 70% tax rates, we were growing faster than any time in U.S. history. So there's an issue about cutting taxes. The American public wants all the benefits and they don't want to pay more. And I think getting a commission to, we have a progressive tax system, but as we've gotten wealthier, more people have high pay a high percentage, but they don't pay nearly as much as they used to. They used to pay a much higher share of their income. If we had kept the same tax structure as we had before Reagan, we would have a lot more revenue. But we've cut it, and it's not clear that we've got any economic benefit from cutting those higher bracket tax rates.
We have one vote for raising taxes.
What are corporate tax rates in other countries? How do you compare?
Maybe some of it,
That-
Corporate.
who knows?
Most of Western Europe companies, the nominal corporate tax rate's around 25%. Ours used to be 35. We cut it to 21. My personal opinion, we overshot the goal. We could be back around with the Western Europe rates of 25% without any damage to anything other than a little bit slower growth than the Dow Industrial Average.
This is something I've done a lot of research on. It's true that our nominal tax rate on corporations is that rate, but if you look at all the loopholes we have, the effective tax rate of the U.S. corporations as a share of GDP is lower than almost any European country. They don't have loopholes like we've got loopholes. So you have to take into account the loopholes, and you see that that's why our tax revenue from corporations has fallen so much.
You had a nice chart up there that showed percentage of where the taxes come from. And one of the things I was very surprised at is how level income tax was and how, when you look at corporate taxes, how much they have really gone
Yeah, that
down
was-
from the year.
That was the point that we just made.
Right.
Yeah.
And then those payroll taxes that have been growing so much are very regressive. They only hit middle income people, they don't hit the highest income people. So just to look at the tax burden by income level and look at the income tax is misleading. The tax structure overall is pretty flat.
Jim,
Who's the Max Stewart?
let me give you some additional depressing news. I teach economics, and I tell my students that I have an incentive to educate them, to increase their productivity, so they'll earn more to cover my benefits.
Good.
So, but the two things that the transition from what I call my century, I'm a baby boomer. So up until 2000, we had much higher population growth and workforce growth and productivity growth. Both of them have declined substantially. Secondly, if you look at what the then all of the baby boomers by the end of this decade will be eligible for Medicare, excuse me. And then the other thing is, if you look at either candidate or all the candidates running for president, what do they want to do about immigration, which brings workers in? They want to cut, which would further reduce the growth in our workforce, which is what pays for Social Security and Medicare for us. So it's not a very pleasant, if things continue, a very pleasant projection of what will transpire.
I think the key is to tax the 50% lower half more, because that's a big chunk of money. It really is.
Well, they don't have anything like that much income now. Actually, the higher ones.
Come
I know you're kidding, but.
on. No, I'm not.
John has signs in his apartment, tax the
You haven't mentioned the impact of inflation on future. I mean, isn't that another form of taxation?
Yeah, I guess inflation in a way is reflected in higher interest rates. That's kind of indirect.
So we're all being taxed
Yeah.
through the inflation.
But impact, yes, impact.
I'll tell a story of something I did several years ago. I opened up a box and I found my very first W-2 form. And in 1956, I earned $36, selling popcorn at the local movie theater. And I had there in that box all my tax returns for the last 50 years. Now, I consider it great fun to get on a worksheet and calculate stuff. And one thing that I've done for myself is calculated the percentage of the relationship of the income tax liability and the numerator and my denominator of my income. And now the year I sold my house and avoided $500,000 of gain, that proportion was about 1%. In the years that I had my knees replaced, it was about 3%. Now, here's the secret. The number that's the numerator is easy. You count, that comes off your tax return. It's the denominator. I added in my University of Texas medical benefit. It's it's around $10,000 a year. To me, that's income. Now, how I use it is another proposition, but that's income. 15% of Social Security that's not in my tax return, that's income. What I get paid on from Medicare for my medical, my knees, doctor came in one day and I was recovering, and I said, "Doctor, I got my final Social Security and Medicare statement. I paid $95,000 into Medicare. How much of that did I use for this knee replacement?" And his eyes rolled because the bill just for the hospital was $110,000. So what you've already shown here today is I'm receiving benefits much greater than what I invested. And so I did this, had fun with this calculation. And my income, that proportion has been an order of 10% for many, many years. I'll be interested to see what it is. I haven't calculated for 2023 yet because Westminster has changed my financial life. But why am I saying anything about this is that people like me are not paying a large percent of taxes in federal income tax. And that numerator for people who are paying into Social Security is larger because they pay not only income tax, but 7% of Social Security. Now, that's an investment if you live long enough. If you die before you get a benefit, it was a tax. So, nevertheless, that's my story, folks. And if you're interested in doing that calculation for yourself, you could say, boy, I've got a great low tax burden. Thank you.
Anybody else? Okay.
I'd just like to mention that Reagan and Tip O'Neill put together a deal back in the early 80s, which basically faced similar problems, and they essentially combined delaying the retirement age with some adjustment to the benefits. They didn't deal very much with Medicare, perhaps not at all. And and they raised taxes. And basically, as Jim Baker says, they rolled a bunch of Republicans. And so right now we face this situation. We also, if the Trump tax, the tax on individuals that currently exists all disappears in January of 2025, or whenever it is, maybe it's sometime in 2025. And if it's not changed or adjusted, then you will return to what basically the error of the Bush tax arrangements. So that will adjust some for individual taxes. So, so I think we have a kind of a complicated, I don't think the only solution is raising taxes or cutting benefits a lot. Yeah.
Part of this is, again, just personal opinion. Look over here. I'm gonna make a guess that the majority of people in this room would not be in favor of Medicare saying you gotta get in line when you need a hip replacement, like they do in other countries. My view is, hey, if I need a hip replacement, I want it now. And that's the part about it. We have gotten, we want it all. And we never want to talk about giving up anything that's coming to us. And that's my view of what one of the big problems is. You can always point to somebody else and say they need to pay more, but we can never point to ourselves and say, okay, maybe I need to take a little less. That's personal opinion.
Well, personally, I would be willing to pay more in taxes. But my feeling is a core issue for Americans is fairness. We will put up with anything if we think it's fair. So, I'm perfectly willing to pay more. But I'd like to be willing to pay fair. And I'm not smart enough to figure out how we make that happen. But I think there's some of the resistance, we've been told for years, well, it's the other guy who's not paying fair
It's
share.
always the other. I don't know if I'm pessimistic about this fiscal commission, if we can ever get it together, that is going to be a tough thing to do. And if they do it, they almost have to come out with an answer that says, everybody has to give a little bit. Yes, the taxes have to go up. And yes, the Medicare expenses have to go down. I don't see how we can get an answer without some combination of both of them.
It has to be bipartisan.
That is
and
really hard. If you're looking to get reelected and you talk about cutting Medicare, just kiss it goodbye.
The good news is the Greenspan Commission, which was noted back here, was set up under Reagan and O'Neill, did in fact do that. It went to the Congress on an up or down vote, no tinkering with the Congress, it's this or nothing, and it passed.
Pass it. The thing to remember is, man,
I'm not an economist either. But we have been involved in the whole discussion when we had followed some of the comparisons between us and the Europe, basically. And in that, on a high scale, their GDP is whatever gains there is actually invested into the society as opposed to the individuals. Whereas all our GDP is more going to individuals. And that's a major difference. So it will be a good thing to see take up European successful country economics and compare that and see how it is.
that's true.
And continuing that is basically, so why did we get to where we are? Is basically one of the big corporate industry that is pointing finger at is the pharmaceutical industry. And that is the one that has really a lot of
They're on my bad guy list. I don't know about the rest of you. Lee, you got a comment?
If you look back at the Greenspan Commission, it said it was successful, but it had a much easier job than what we're talking about. The Greenspan Commission was facing both Reagan and O'Neill did not want a crisis in Social Security, which was right upon them. And they needed to deal with a very popular program that was going to have to revenue, but they didn't raise, they mostly raised revenue into the future. They didn't raise taxes immediately, entirely now. They didn't cut benefits for anybody at the time. They cut benefits for people who were gonna retire in the future. That, you're not gonna deal with our kind of current problems with those kind of much more palatable political solutions.
Well, back there at that time, the nature of the problem was much less than it is today too. So
And
they
it's very
didn't have to
focused
do
on
near as
Social
much to make
Security.
a difference.
Everybody wanted, both sides wanted to continue the Social Security. They couldn't, neither side could be responsible for cutting Social Security benefits. So they had to get around it somehow. And they mostly hit people who were gonna retire in the future. They didn't cut anybody's current benefits. That's hard to do that.
Bernie?
I'd like to comment on one of your slides, that got Alpha D. Newman on there. And, when I was, what I like about that was the picture there. What we worry is because most of us are not going to be around when we run out of Social Security money. And so I sort of fall into that category. I don't have to worry about it because I'm probably not going to be here in 2032 or whatever it is, and most of us sort of fall into that same situation. But that's a bad way to look at the overall problem.
None of us hope to live 8 years.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.